Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast. Today is episode 102, and we're going to be talking with Professor David Fauser, who is an adjunct professor at several universities in the Los Angeles, California area. Today we're going to vary a little bit from what we traditionally do, which is look at a specific topic or phenomenon or problem in history itself, and we're going to actually talk a little bit about the field of history and what it's like to be a historian, and specifically an adjunct professor. As many of you are no doubt aware, the job market for professional historians is not great at the moment. And since one of our most common questions on Ask Historians is what it's like to try and be an adjunct professor and try and look for a tenure track position, I thought that it might do well to do an episode on this topic. Before we jump in, since this is the first episode of the month, I'm going to be doing the book raffle. This month, the winner was Max M. Max has three options. He has The War of the End of the World by Mario Vargas Llosa, Reappraisals, Reflections on the Forgotten 20th Century by Tony Judt, or Distant Strangers, How Britain Became Modern by James Vernon. Now, the first option, the novel by Mario Vargas Llosa, is a bit of a departure from what we usually do, in that it's not actually a book of history. It's a historical novel. It's a novel by Mario Vargas Llosa on the Canudos Rebellion in late 19th century Brazil. While it is not a history text as such, I think it is a very valuable book and a very valuable read for anyone who studies history, because it looks at the way in which people can misinterpret phenomena that are right in front of them, and just try and impose categories and concepts which aren't actually adapted for the context they're trying to interpret. So if you're interested in a great historical novel by Nobel Prize winner Mario Vargas Llosa, that's a good pick. Tony Jut's essays it's an excellent book of essays on different figures and problems of the 20th century, including some excellent essays on Eric Hobsbawm and Henry Kissinger, which I highly recommend. And the final option, which is Professor Fauser's recommendation, is Distant Strangers, How Britain Became Modern by James Vernon. While I have not read the book myself, it comes very highly recommended by Professor Fauser, and the book details the social, economic, and political transformations which led to the modernization of Britain. So Max, just get in contact with us, and we'd be happy to send that out to you. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you'd like to support the podcast, you can support us at patreon.com/AskHistorians. Be sure to be on the lookout for Brian Watson's episode in 2 weeks. Hope to have you with us then.
Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast. Today we're talking with Professor David Fauser. David is an adjunct professor in California, where he teaches a vast variety of different topics to very lucky students who get to have him as a professor. David, welcome.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here.
Pleasure to have you. So today we're actually not going to be doing what we usually do on the podcast, which is talking about a very specific academic topic like the Russian Revolution or something like that. And we're going to instead be talking about what it's like to be an adjunct professor and what it's like to work in academia in the United States right now. So David, if you could talk a little bit about who you are and what your background is.
Of course. So I am a native of Southern California. I earned my bachelor's degree and master's degree at California State University, Northridge, and I completed my PhD at UC Irvine in 2016. And I studied the cultural and environmental history of wheat, flour, and bread in modern Britain. Your listeners may be familiar with the episode that I recorded last year on those topics, 2 episodes. Now, today, I teach at 3 different institutions, and that's Santa Monica College, which is a community college, and it's one of the better community colleges in the region. We have, I think, the highest rate of transfers to UCLA of any community college in the region. I also teach at Chapman University, which is a fairly small private university in the city of Orange in Orange County. And I teach at Laguna College of Art and Design, which is a very small art college in Orange County as well. And I want to give a quick thank you to Laguna College for letting me use their equipment, because that's what I'm talking into right now.
Great. Just so our listeners have an idea, what's the difference between an adjunct professor position and a tenure position?
Well, the tenure or tenure track, the central difference is that tenured or even tenure track people are full-time. And there are some universities or colleges that have full-time but non-tenure track. But for the most part, what we find is there are tenured or tenure track professors who are full-time. And then you have a bunch of adjuncts who teach almost exclusively part-time. And we are generally on semester or sometimes year-long contracts. So, for example, I don't really know what I'm going to teach in a particular semester until a couple of months before it. So I don't know what I'm going to teach in the summer. I have no idea what I'm going to teach the fall. My classes for winter and spring are set. But as a short-term, really contract employee, I have no real job security. I could be effectively fired if they simply refused to offer me like a new class. So, it's Uber for college instructors, I guess. With the downside that it's actually quite difficult to even get adjunct jobs. They pay poorly. We make less per class than full-time instructors, full-time professors, and we have very little security. I get benefits from one of my positions at Santa Monica because we have a very good union there. So I do get things like health insurance through them. But I don't get things like retirement benefits. The pay is poor and the job security is non-existent.
That's pretty somber.
Yeah. As I've told a lot of people, the work is wonderful. I love to teach. I think it's what I'm best at in life overall. And my students seem to like me. But the career is bad. This is not a career, really, is what I should say, because I have very little avenue for advance. The traditional way that one advances as an academic is by research. But for tenured or tenure track professors, they have greater access to funding for research. They are paid better, so they don't have to teach quite so many classes, so they have more time to research. But research is effectively unpaid labor. It's the unpaid foundation of the whole academic enterprise. And since adjuncts are paid only to teach, if I want to research, then obviously I'm not getting paid for that. But I'm getting paid at a lower rate for the teaching that I do, and so I have to pick up as many classes as I possibly can, which means that research is more and more difficult. And of course, something like a sabbatical to write or something like that is completely out of the question. Because I'm paid on a contract basis per term.
And I'd imagine that it also means that because you have less control, you're less able to plan ahead on what you're even going to teach. Despite the fact that you give it your all to your students, it also impacts, like what the classes are like.
What do you mean by what the classes are like?
Well, like you're saying, you don't really know that far ahead what you're going to be teaching on.
That's true.
So if you were able to plan further ahead, you would be able to specialize more.
That's true to an extent, although in practice, it's not really a problem because they tend to have adjuncts teach the same classes over and over. And generally, what you find is that the tenured or tenure track professors want to teach more specialized courses, and that the adjuncts will end up teaching the surveys. So I teach a lot of Western Civ, parts 1 and 2. I teach a lot of world history, parts 1 and 2. I teach European history, and then I have some more specialized classes that I teach at Chapman, and I do teach some specialized courses elsewhere. I teach a global environmental history class at Santa Monica, and I do a history of zombies at Laguna College. But for the most part, if you look at any given history department in the United States, you'll find a bunch of tenured or tenure-track professors who teach the upper division seminars, certainly the graduate classes. And then you'll find a collection of adjuncts or other part-time instructors who teach the bulk of the kind of U.S. History Part 1 or World History Part 2 or Western Civ or whatever it is.
I know we're going to move on to other points as well, but if you could like summarize in 30 seconds, I think people might want to hear, what do you mean by history of zombies?
Oh, sure. What do I mean by the history of zombies? Well, so it's a history of zombies really in American and global culture. So the first part of the class, the first few weeks of it, we go through and we look for kind of the oldest examples of undead things that we can find. So, you go looking for pieces in classical literature of people who are back from the dead. There aren't really that many. We've experimented with things like reading the Tibetan Book of the Dead. It actually doesn't work in the class like that well. But then we move into zombies and their origins in West Africa and their interconnections to the creation of the Atlantic world, the slave trade, and ultimately to, as I argue in the class, to American and global capitalism.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's a pretty fun class, to be honest. We watch, like, The Walking Dead. We read World War Z, which is a much better book than it is movie. I'm going to have them do Frankenstein this year. Frankenstein's going to be our first major text, and we'll see how that goes. I'm pretty excited about it. It's going to be a fun class.
Nice. And what university you said this was?
This is at Laguna College, so these are art students.
Okay, so anyone who's going to Laguna, take the history of zombies with Professor Fauser.
It's gonna rock. It's gonna rock, and it's a late night class too. It's late on Thursday nights, so it's gonna always be dark when we have the class.
Nice.
It's gonna be good stuff.
Yeah. Okay. So back to adjunct life and all the rest. I've heard that adjuncts are far more common or make up a far larger part of the workforce at universities than they used to. Would that be an accurate statement?
Yes. I don't have the numbers in front of me, so I may be slightly off. But the numbers are something like this. If you look at the amount, like the number of classes that are taught by tenured faculty in like 1970, it's something like 2/3 of all college classes. And so, even then, even in this sort of golden age of the American Academy, you've got like 1/3 of instructors are part-time. Today, however, it's more like 2/3 or even up to 3/4 of classes are taught by part-time or adjunct faculty. And to some extent, this is like, there are definitely cases in which tenured professors or tenure lines, that is, so the institution will have a line of funding that will go to a particular professor, to a particular like a spot. And there are certainly cases in which those tenure lines have been, once somebody retires, they will move that funding to something else, maybe to a different discipline, or they'll do something with it. And in some cases, they're not replaced. From what I understand, the bigger picture is that over this time, very few new tenured lines have been added. So as the size of the American population grows, as the college population gets larger and larger, more and more of that growth is being handled by adjuncts. So rather than building an even larger kind of body of tenured, faculty that can do both research and teach, the American Academy is increasingly moving toward a system where you have a very large group of instructors who are part-time, poorly paid teachers, and then a smaller group, relatively smaller group of tenured faculty who focus more on research and do some teaching.
Well, that's not good, or at least it doesn't sound very good for adjuncts and people who are thinking of studying history.
I think that's right. Yeah, and it's gotten a lot worse in the past 10 years since the Great Recession. The financial collapse and the Great Recession starting in 2007 and 2008. If you look at the job ads that go out along, on sort of like HNet or through the American Historical Association, things like that, the bottom really falls out in about 2008, and it's been a really strong decline since then. And I believe we're less than half the number of annual job positions are being advertised. And that's happening even as the number of PhDs that are being awarded is growing or at best is the same. Now, some people have argued, and this is a common line of argument, that there are too many PhDs being awarded, that there's too many academics being made, and that these people are foolish for getting a PhD when there aren't that many jobs. I think that relies on the fairly antiquated notion that a PhD is only good for teaching or only good for work in the academy. But it is definitely true that of the people who are earning PhDs now, it is much harder than ever before to get a full-time tenure track position in academia.
Something to definitely think about. I say that while applying to grad school myself. And how would you say that this move to adjuncts, who have to focus basically most if not all of their professional time on teaching over research, how do you think that this has impacted research at all?
It's hard to say. I mean, I can look at my Twitter feed, and I can talk to my friends, and I can look at AskHistorians, and I see a lot of research being done. There's a lot out there. I'm consistently amazed at the high quality of work that is being done by people literally around the world. On the other hand, if we have a long-term structural shift in the academy toward a large group of academics who are not given the funding, the time, the opportunity to research, in other words, in which research is not rewarded, then I think we will see less research overall. And it's good to remember, especially coming from where we are with AskHistorians, that research, largely unpaid research, or not directly paid, nobody publishes a paper in Journal of American History and gets a big check for doing that. That's just not how the system works. So research is not really paid at the sort of point of delivery. But you have to have a large number of scholars doing a lot of work in a lot of different fields to really have a healthy and robust academy. And if we are systematically undermining that by moving toward adjunctification, by moving toward a large body of professors who teach classes and have to teach 6, 7 classes per term and don't have time to research, are not given funding to research, then I think it is fair to say, I don't see any way in which the quality and quantity of research does not decline in the long run that way.
Something to consider. Now, before we move on to our next big point, we just wanted to give you an opportunity to share your hot take on the grad student tax, which does not appear to have made it into the final tax bill as of today, the 8th of December. However, it may come back in some shape or form.
I mean, my hot take is that it is certain political factions in the United States kind of sticking it to a population that they don't really like very much. But I actually don't think it's going to be as devastating as many have said. So what the tax would do, once you are a graduate student, I mean, you still in theory have to pay tuition or whatever the fee structure is for your particular institution. And PhDs take a long time. Normative time at Irvine when I was there was 7 years. I happened to have a small child at an inopportune time, so it actually took me 9 years. And I used to think that that was like crazy long, and I've come to learn that more and more people that I know actually took even longer than that. So it is a very long process, and it's not really school. You're not really a student for most of it. Most of the time you get in there, you take a couple of years of coursework, and then you research. You research and you teach as a graduate student TA, teaching assistant, or in some cases a teaching associate. And although you're still sort of technically counted as a student, so you have these fees that you're allegedly supposed to pay, most graduate students do not actually pay these fees. What we get instead is what's called a tuition waiver. So what I would get at the University of California is a kind of account, my personal account with the university that would say that I owe X amount of money. My memory's fuzzy on this. I think it was about $5,000 per quarter for a PhD student. They would sort of send you a bill for that, and then immediately would say, this fee has been waived because you're gonna be a TA, or you've got a research associate spot, or something. And so they would just wash that out. So it's not like you get a check for this. It's really kind of like, it's a weird form of accounting. Now, the American Academy is, broadly speaking, a set of conservative institutions. And I mean small c. That is, they don't like to change. And if you were to actually tax the money that students are sort of magically accounted in these tuition waivers, that is, you were to say this tuition waiver was actually income, when, of course, no student ever sees it, and therefore you tax it as income, and you dramatically increase the tax bill of this population of graduate students, then it would be financially unviable for many, many, many people to be graduate students. And the academy relies on graduate students. The professors rely on graduate students as research assistants. The universities themselves rely on grad students to teach or TA a lot of classes. The model at the University of California is to have very large lectures of 300 students or more, and then have a whole bunch of what are called discussion sections. That is, 20 student classes that are run by TAs. And so if you take away if you take away grad students, then you have a real labor shortage in the academy. And that would force universities to change in some significant ways. They would either have to change the way that they allocate teaching duties, or you'd have a bunch of professors who would have to find new ways to do research. And I think it is much more likely that most of these administrations will come up with some way to kind of magic the accounting there to say that these students are not getting tuition waivers. I don't know what that will look like. I don't know the administration of, the sort of money side of the university especially well. I never worked in those particular areas of administration. But I strongly suspect that this will not be quite the catastrophe that it has been suggested to be. But I could be wrong.
Yeah. I mean, given what you said in the earlier part of the interview where you discussed how fundamental adjunct labor is for the functioning of the university, I mean, that given that, they have every incentive to figure out a way to make it work, right? Which is your point.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's true.
And so, finally, I'd like to talk a little bit about something that we've talked about privately, like online and in direct messages and things like that. About it is Western Civ courses and the bit of the controversy which has gone around, like how they're taught and the purpose of the programs at all in colleges right now. So would you like to kind of set the scene of what the context is?
Sure, and there's a couple of ways we can do this, and I'll sort of start one way, and you can push me in other directions if you think that's more useful. So the American Academy in particular has a much more robust general education, what we might call sort of liberal arts, that is, making bachelor's students, students going for a 4-year degree, take a wide range of courses. So, when I was at Cal State Northridge, as a history major, I was a history major almost from the first day. I took classes in anthropology, I took sociology, I had to take math, I took composition. Basically, everybody takes composition. I took several different science classes. I took a class in computer programming, which was 1999, and it was wild. But the whole idea is that the academy in the United States is meant to teach students a wide range of things. And so our degrees take longer. You can get a degree in a less amount of time, in a significantly shorter amount of time. If you were to go to school in Britain or other parts of Europe, their degrees are faster. The downside of that is that their universities are smaller. They teach fewer classes because students are required to take fewer classes. So fewer classes exist, right? But in the United States, we tend to teach more. We have a sort of broader teaching mission than most universities, in most academies and other places. And what that looks like for history is that each history department is going to offer a series of surveys, and virtually every student on that campus is going to be required to take generally a U.S. survey, often 2 parts, or at Irvine it was 3 parts because it was a quarter system, so you had to take 3/4 of it. And then either a world or Western Civ survey that is, again, like usually a couple of parts. Now that's kind of the employment for people like me. This is one reason that I live and work here still, even though, I might be tempted to go and live in Britain or someplace else. But it would be very hard for me to find work there, whereas I can find work here. Like that, the jobs exist for me here, whereas there are fewer of them in other places. So you have this Western Civ world history survey that pretty much all students have to take. And this has become a kind of cultural flashpoint, I think, in recent decades. Really, there are certain scholars who study what are called the canon wars. One I'm thinking of in particular. I don't know if I should mention her name or not. You'll edit this out. She might actually get hate for it. LD Burnett on Twitter is amazing. She does a lot of this. So okay, let me go back to it being a flashpoint. Okay, so these courses have been a little bit of a cultural flashpoint, really for decades, if not forever, because if you're going to make a whole bunch of people take history classes, you kind of recognize that a history class is very much a story about people and about the world. And those have cultural and political implications. So for a long time, there has been a lot of debate over what should students be taught in a U.S. history class. So Lynn Cheney, former Vice President Dick Cheney's wife, was quite involved in these kinds of things, and her argument would be that American history classes, and this was I believe this was in the 90s and the early 2000s, her argument was that American history classes were not sufficiently laudatory of the United States, that they were too critical, that they focused too much on bad things, and that really what they should be doing is teaching students to really love the United States. Now, I think a lot of the instructors of these classes would disagree, both with her assessment of their effects, but also of the goals of what it's for. But you can see how if you're going to make everyone take these classes, then the content of these classes can be a big deal.
Yeah, no, I mean, yeah, fair enough. So, I mean, if it's an obligatory course for everybody, it's definitely going to be that's supposed to give you a grounding in the humanities. I mean, it's understandable that maybe what's taught and what's not taught, or what's pointedly absent from the course, might be an issue of controversy. especially in this climate.
Right. And I think it's important to consider, so like let's just consider the history of Western more specifically, let's consider the historiography of Western civilization. So we don't really see like an institutionalized set of ideas about Western civilization until the 20th century. In the 19th century, historians were very much focused on the idea of the national state. That was the sort of origin of the profession, is you had these historians who really wanted to sort of be as objective as they possibly could, but they really saw their role in society as kind of telling the history of their national state. And so, like, to give an example of this, if we go to someone like Frederick Jackson Turner, his 1893 frontier thesis is, I mean, I wouldn't say too many people think that it's correct, but it's still widely read as a foundational moment in the historiography of the United States. And without going into too much detail, what Turner was trying to do with his frontier thesis was explain a kind of American national character as it related to democracy. And that is the story of a national state, right? So in the 19th century, if you go to college history classes and you sort of look at what people are writing and understand as well that the academy in the 19th century was very small compared to today, the focus would be on national histories. But in the early 20th century, and especially in the wake of World War I, you have a push. The idea of a kind of Western civilization develops. And the idea of Western civilization is in a sense to tie together largely Western Europe and North America into a broader narrative, and to reach back into classical antiquity to find precedents for things like democratic or republican rule. This leads to the classic Western civilization narrative, which is, like, frankly, analytically, it's a total mess. It focuses on states. It has a real preoccupation with the idea of rising and falling civilizations. It is heavily focused on political history. And so it's like political history and the history of imperial states often, but in particular of the democratic or republican ideologies that might underlie these empires or states, right? So if I can just sort of walk through like what the classic Western Civ narrative is. If we were to go to a history class in like 1960, this is roughly what we would get. We would get Western Civ as a class beginning probably with ancient Mesopotamia or Egypt as the first cities in Western Eurasia. So they would discuss things like Uruk, or, you know, the sort of Egyptian pharaohs, things like that. It would then shift to classical Greece. You get a sort of classical Greece narrative, built often with particular attention to Athenian democracy. And then you would shift to Rome, so that in the classic Western Civ narrative, Rome always comes after Greece, although they overlap in time considerably. So you get then a discussion of Roman Republic and how the Roman Republic sort of corrupts and decays and becomes the Roman Empire. Then you get the fall of the Roman Empire, which in Western Civ narratives is broadly seen as a bad thing in the classical narrative, as a bad thing, followed by the medieval period, which is generally regarded as 1,000 years of not that much happening. Since, you know, medieval means like kind of middle. The Western Civ narrative really likes the Renaissance, because the Renaissance is the rediscovery, allegedly, of sort of classical Greek and Roman ideas of democracy and rational philosophy and things like that. The Reformation is a big moment in Western civilization. And then you get like the Scientific Revolution, the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, and then into 19th century sort of development and 20th century wars. And the overall sort of thrust of this we might describe as a kind of Whig history. That is, a history of, broadly speaking, generally increasing knowledge, increasing sort of rationality, increasing democracy. Really, if you took the people who were in power in places like Britain or the United States, to some extent France and Germany, in like 1925, and you said, hey, like, what do you guys think is good? And they would say, well, democracy and modern science and capitalism and, you know, a variety of other things. And Western civilization narratives were kind of built from that viewpoint looking backwards. So they would go looking in the past for the origins of those particular things. And analytically, that's a mess, because you end up with no stable group of people are Western, and certainly the geographical boundaries of what counts as Western civilization are a total mess. I mean, I don't think that anybody today would regard Iraq as part of the West, although it plays a huge role in any Western civ textbook.
Yeah, and I think, was it Montesquieu or Voltaire? I think one of the classical enlightened French writers, he wrote that, I think Europe ends at the Pyrenees, so Spain didn't count.
Right. Yeah, so a good example of how important historical people, processes, places will kind of move in and out of this Western civ narrative is that Spain, like the Iberian Peninsula, is obviously a significant component of the Roman Empire, of the, you know, like it's a big chunk of it. Doesn't really get a lot of play in Western civ, because Western civ narratives are much more concerned with kind of imperial politics or republican politics. But Spain, or the people who inhabit the Iberian Peninsula, will be considered very important for the role of Columbus, because Columbus, although not himself Spanish, is going to, you know, sails across the Atlantic sort of, you know, in the employment of the monarchs of Spain, and gets there, and, you know, his sort of quote-unquote discovery then leads to a very large Spanish empire. But Spain hardly plays a role in Western civ narratives outside of that one particular sort of process of colonizing the New World. When really, like, objectively speaking, I mean, they're pretty far west, right? They should play an important role throughout.
I mean, at the very least, Portugal. I mean, it's the furthest west you can go.
Right? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so I mean, it's really, it definitely does make sense in the sense that it's an ex post facto, it's an after the fact reconstruction to build a very specific narrative. And I mean, you're currently teaching Western Civ courses, among other things. How much, and you talked about how that used to be taught. How much emphasis is given in these courses to things which may slightly tarnish the topics being touched, like the Athenian democracy, but it's also a slave owning democracy. It's actually, yeah, it's more of an oligarchy in that sense.
I would say, and this is like historiographical hot take, I would say that the broad thrust of historical and even humanistic and social science research over the past 50 years or more, even you could even go back to like post-1945 research, but certainly from the 1960s in earnest, the broad program of research has been to interrogate this Western civilization narrative. And you can see it in pretty much every field, every discipline, just about, and every subfield of history. So you could, I mean, take your pick. If you want to take, for example, social history, broadly speaking, if we go back to 1950s, 1960s social history, this is history of everyday life, histories that are trying to understand things like real wages, incomes for people. In a very basic way, you have, in the 50s and 60s, a lot of historians who are writing and beginning to try to understand what is life like for people who are not popes or presidents or princes. That right there is a challenge to Western civilization, because the Western civilization narrative is very top-down. It cares a lot about the ideology of Republican Rome, about the rhetoric of, Republican senators and how this sort of collapses into empire. The traditional Western civilization narrative does not say, what is it like for the working classes in, Hellenistic Egypt or something. Like, those were just not questions that were asked previously. But in the 50s and 60s, you get this sort of flourishing of social history, and it continues well after that. I say 50s and 60s because those are the kind of roots of it as I understand it. So simply saying, what is the history of everyday life, a sort of history from below, those are real challenges to this broad narrative of Western civilization. And you could carry that through to cultural history. I mean, cultural history, I would say, is effectively a critique of social history. And what I mean by this, the way I explain this in class is social history argues that change happens because of experiences that people share. That is, at its core, a kind of historical materialism, like in a deep way, although this is not to say that all social historians are Marxist or are necessarily looking for, the coming communism or something like that. But, the core insight of Marx is that economy matters and that, people respond to their economic situations, right? And so social history kind of says, well, let's try to understand the broad experiences of as many people as possible and try to figure out why people are doing what they're doing. And in many cases, we find that works. I mean, if you want to understand the labor movements of the 19th century, it makes a lot of sense to look at things like real wages or working conditions. And then you can tie those to things like the growth of trade unions. And that's a pretty clear sort of people are experiencing these things, and then they respond to these historical experiences in other ways, right? Cultural history looks at that same kind of process and says, there are lots of cases where people seem to share certain experiences, but don't respond in the same way. Or they seem to be responding to things that are perhaps not objectively true. For example, we can look at things like the real wages of, working class British people in the 1840s. And we can find that those real wages might be going up or going down, right? And so we can say, well, their material circumstances are getting better or getting worse. But there are plenty of cases where people do not, where we can identify historically that material circumstances seem to look a certain way, but people are not responding to them in the way that we might expect. And if people are not responding to what we might say are quote-unquote objective material circumstances, then cultural history suggests that change is happening in history not because of experiences that people share, but broadly speaking, because of these stories that people tell. And that is story in a very broad sense. That is, the idea of the national state is a story. I mean, the story of the American nation is that English colonists landed in Eastern North America in the late 1500s and early 1600s, that they developed a set of institutions that were based on the frontier and on sort of democracy, and that when that mean, English king tried to tax them too much, they were not having it, and then they, got their three-cornered hats and their muskets, and they fought the British and they won, and then, there's your American nation, right? That's a story. And people value these stories. These stories are important to people. We could think of gender as a story. Race is a story. Any of these deep cultural categories, these are at a fundamental level stories. And very frequently people respond to things in history, they act in history, according to their perception of these stories, how these stories are told.
Interesting. It's definitely it definitely breaks with the scheme or the methodology that at least more traditional Marxist historians have, which is which is based on the material life. This is saying that sometimes the theoretical life can kind of twist around and sometimes contradict the material realities that people are living in. So you got to study both. I guess it would be called I think it's a field now, the imagination, popular imagination, I think is the term for it.
I haven't come across that. One of the things...
You haven't come across it?
Not really. There's a long history in French historiography of studying the mentalité, the kind of mental worlds of people.
Yeah, mentalité. There's also Lou Perez wrote a book called Cuban the American Imagination, and in the imagination seems to also be a field where they try and do that. They try and say, well, the study of the objective reality is really important, and here's a couple books on that. But also, let's just see how this was perceived, and it's just entirely about perception.
Oh. Right. Yeah, I understand what you mean. Yeah. So it's like a sort of history of representations of things.
Exactly.
Or of how people discuss things, which is the discourse, right? So discourse is a cultural history term that really captures how people discuss certain historical moments or processes or events or whatever. And to your point, if you have a kind of confused, maybe not confused, if you have a complex set of debates that link social history and cultural history, both of those sort of historical methods really deconstruct the older Western civ narratives of kind of great men, of, this long series of kind of progressing institutions, the development of democracy. When we study those processes from a social and a cultural perspective, and especially when we bring those perspectives together, we find that this old Western civilization narrative just doesn't hold up very well. It kind of falls apart in virtually every area. And one example of this would be the scientific revolution. So if we go to the 19th century and we said, hey, eminent historians, what is the story of science? They would have been very confident and very clear that people like Galileo and Bacon and Newton kind of invented science, that these were the ones who really learned to be objective about the universe and learned to use mathematics to describe the universe, and that they were totally certain of their knowledge. And for a long time then, in the classic narrative, the scientific revolution is a story in which certain European people become rational and smart and figure out the universe. And by doing that, they sort of banish the superstition and ignorance of the Middle Ages, and they are laying the foundations for the Enlightenment and its rational basis for republic and democracy. And this is a kind of objectively good thing. And what we find is the historiography really doesn't support that. So Thomas Kuhn's famous book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, which I believe is first published way back in 1960.
Read it. Everybody's listening. Read it.
Yeah, it's pretty good. It's worth your time. It's really worth your time. I mean, but the overall argument of that book is to kind of say that science is not the story of just discovering stuff that's objectively true. That there is a paradigm shift, that there is a kind of deep structure of knowledge that changes over time. And I'm not sure if Kuhn actually goes this far. I don't think he quite goes this far as to say that science is relative. But he's laying an intellectual foundation for that. He's critiquing the idea that science is not relative. And so, a generation after Kuhn, you have someone like Stephen Shapin, whose book, The Scientific Revolution, which is another one that I would absolutely recommend, he quite famously opens that book by saying, there's no such thing as the scientific revolution, and this is a book about it. And I think that really captures how we teach Western civilization today, which is that we are more or less stuck with a lot of historiography, a lot of history writing, a deep structure of a historical narrative that still does go kind of Mesopotamia, Greece, Rome, Middle Ages, Enlightenment, industrialization, democracy kind of thing. But you can't honestly teach these things today without offering really pretty profound critiques of them. And so my advisor as an undergraduate used to begin his Western Civ class by saying, there's no such thing as Western Civ, and this is a class about it.
Wow. And so, I mean, basically, the Western Civ is this kind of chimera of these different periods and regions and aspects of these periods, because they didn't just talk about really, it's not classical Greece, it's Athens and maybe a little bit of Sparta to give it a little bit of contrast and flavor. But so it's got this chimeric value. But what is your hot take on? I think I've said hot take 4 times this interview. It's a good term. It's a good term. Yeah, it's a good term. What would your what do you think would be a good way to try and if you could change this type of course in a fundamental way, or a couple fundamental ways, what would you recommend?
I think that change is already underway, and that change is world history. I mean, the whole subfield of world history really emerges as a very broad set of critiques of the notion that Western civilization is a coherent narrative. And if you're going to start to question the boundaries of Western civilization, then a logical, I think a rational and a very useful response is to say, well, let's pull our lens back. Let's consider Europe in a global context. And I think that's really where we are now. And so if you look at a really important book, I think honestly one of the most important books of the last generation. I might be biased because I know the author and he was on my committee and we're friends. But if you look at Ken Pomerantz's book, The Great Divergence, this came out in 2001, I think. This is a book that is about the rise of the West, which is a crucial element of the Western civilization narrative. Now, the classical Western civilization narrative says that the rise of the West happens because Westerners are better at capitalism, because they're better at inventing things, because they invent science, because they have better institutions. It is a Eurocentric view of the rise of the West. And what Pomerantz does is a much more rigorous comparison of Europe and China than had ever been done before. I mean, he is a historian of China, so his focus, his real core research is on the history of China. He is much more rigorous about comparing particular regions of Europe and China. And what he finds is that up until about 1800 or so, which is relatively late according to the classic Western Civ narrative, that in his words, there is a world of surprising similarities. That is, the people who are living in, say, southern England have lives that are not that materially different from someone living in, say, the lower Yangtze Delta in China. And there's a whole set of regions around the world that look quite similar. I mean, he points to certain regions of Japan, he points to parts of South Asia, various parts of Europe. There's a whole range of places where in about 1800 or in the century before that, living standards are pretty much the same. And he also finds that many of the traditional explanations for Western ascendance turn on the idea that Westerners, Europeans, are kind of better at institutional capitalism. And the way that you would measure this is by looking at like factor markets, sort of how efficient the markets are for land, labor, and capital. And what he finds is that in China, the markets for land, labor, and capital are at least as efficient in, say, 1750 or 1800 as they are in Europe. And so we simply cannot empirically look at Europe in the 18th century and say these people are inventing capitalism and that's why Europeans will get rich in the 19th century while much of the rest of the world does not. And instead he finds that it has much more to do with energy supplies, that is coal in particular, that there's a lot more contingency built into inventions, the steam engine, which is invented in wet coal mines, and China kind of famously does not have wet coal mines, they have dry coal mines, and that colonialism plays a major role in this, and that it's really the Western powers' ability to draw on resources from around the world that allows them to create a kind of industrial base in Western Europe that then leads to a global power imbalance in which Europeans get rich and the rest of the world does not. Now that's a real fundamental challenge to core ideas of Western civilization. And I would say it's a central text of world history.
Interesting. I mean, I'm definitely going to make sure to pick it up. It coincides with something that a couple of more recent scholars that I've been reading have been saying. I think Sven Beckert, who's a Harvard historian of capitalism, made the point in his book Empire of Cotton that while a lot of books tend to assume that the English got superiority were superior in terms of textile technology pretty early on, and that's why they won over economically and were basically able to beat out Indian textiles because India was the hub of basically the Eurasian textile production. Them and China. Sven Beckert makes the point that they really only were able to beat out in terms of quality and quantity in the early 19th century. Like until then they were mostly making money as middlemen for Indian textiles or selling cheap but also very low quality goods to many different regions.
Right, and this is a much less flattering tale than the Western civilization narrative we might get in, say, 1960, when you would have a much more laudatory story of, like, wonderful inventors like, Arkwright or Watt or Bolton or whoever, and the story would be about how these inventors were, like, terrific, and they came up with all these machines that really made sort of British business like objectively better than everybody else. So a story like Beckert's, like Pomerantz, and we could even take a step even further back in time and look at something like Linda Schaefer's work from I think the early 90s on her concept of Southernization. So she came up with the concept of Southernization to describe the development of commercial networks and things like spice trading and cotton textile trading in the Indian Ocean region in the centuries which in a Western civilization narrative are like the Middle Ages and there's not very much happening in this classical narrative. And her argument in her Southernization writing is to say that Southernization happens well before anything we might call Westernization, and that it creates a relatively affluent kind of global South based on South Asia in particular, South China, the Middle East, and that really what happens in the later Middle Ages and the early modern period is that Europeans get their hands on a whole bunch of things that are really the product of Southernization. And then they reuse these things like printing, the compass, spice trading, sugar cultivation, cotton textiles, a bunch of them. And that Europeans take these things that are really a product of an older period of development and sort of use them in new ways. And again, that's a challenge to this traditional and often quite, how should we put it, almost isolationist view of Western civilization. The classic Western civilization narrative seems to me to work really hard to build walls around, broadly speaking, Europeans. Yeah. And I think the more that we know, the more we study the rest of the world, the more we find those walls never existed. They didn't exist in the past. They don't seem to exist now. And they're really kind of a figment of our imagination.
Yeah, and to go back to your point about the prosperity of the South in that period, or the global South in that period. One of the points that another really great author from the early 90s, who unfortunately seems to have passed away, Janet Abu-Lughod, wrote about
classic.
in Before European Hegemony, was that the European expansion also came in after a series of significant collapses, including the Mongol destruction of Baghdad in what is the late Middle Ages for Europe.
1258.
And they sacked the city, and it would have been like if Athens in classical Greece was sacked. It was devastated, and that really set back the region by in significant ways.
Absolutely, and so we can look at people like Schaeffer, Beckert, Abu-Lughod, Pomerantz. This is part of that's the tip of the iceberg for world history. Take those insights about the connections in roughly speaking global trade, and recognize that those same kinds of connections, those same kinds of broad research findings that challenge the Western civilization narrative, those are true in virtually every subfield. It is almost impossible now to teach a Western Civ course and to be honest about what the research shows, and not have it be almost totally the opposite of what it would have been in, say, 1960. We just know a lot more now, and we have found that old narrative just does not hold water, empirically or theoretically.
This has been a fascinating conversation. Professor David Fauser, thanks again for coming on with us and talking about your experiences as an adjunct professor.
Well, it was an absolute pleasure, and I'm happy to do it anytime you like.
I'm sure we'll have you on again in the near future.
Radical.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. Please support us at patreon.com/AskHistorians. Find more history like this by following us on Twitter and Facebook, and by visiting us at askhistorians.reddit.com, and ask hundreds of historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know about history.